Facts about slavery that you weren't taught in school. Many times in human history, the slave master has been brown and the slaves have been white. Over 1 million Christian Europeans were enslaved by the Islamic Barbary states of North Africa between the 16th and 19th centuries. A particularly valuable type of slave was pale-skinned Christian women. They were highly sought after by Muslim men and often fetched a high price at slave markets. The famous author Miguel de Cervantes, the writer of the character Don Quixote, he himself was captured from a ship and taken to Algiers. He was a slave for 5 years before a ransom was eventually paid. Facts about slavery that they didn't teach you in school. For many centuries, it was white Christian Europeans who were slaves in Africa. For almost 300 years, the southern coast of Europe was incredibly vulnerable to the Islamic Barbary states and their slave raiding. Both coastal communities and Christian ships were often targeted. One such slave raider, Turgut Reis, was considered one of the greatest Turkish admirals of his day. In 1551, he raided the Maltese island of Gozo. In this incident, 5,000 people, the entire population, were enslaved. In 1554, he then attacked Vieste in Italy. The men were massacred, but 7,000 women and children were taken off to be slaves. As far north as Ireland was attacked, in 1631 the town of Baltimore was attacked by the Barbary pirates and the population taken to be slaves in Algiers. Facts about slavery that you weren't taught in school. The United States' first war as an independent country was launched to free Americans who were being held as slaves in Africa. In 1801, President Thomas Jefferson launched the First Barbary War. Jefferson had long wanted to use military force against the Barbary pirates who were enslaving American sailors. Jefferson ordered the Navy and the Marine Corps to blockade the port of Tripoli and convince its ruler to hand over the American slaves and hostages. This was met with mixed success. Notable incidents such as the burning of the USS Philadelphia took place by American sailors to prevent it falling to enemy hands. Through a combination of military force and diplomacy, the hostages and slaves were eventually released. The war established the Marine Corps as an integral part of the American military, the legacy of which lasts to this day, as the words "Shores of Tripoli" are in the Marines' hymn, a reference to the Barbary Wars. Facts about Africa that you weren't taught in school. In the late 19th century, one of the most powerful and wealthy slave traders in Africa was not European, not American, but an African named Tipu Tip, an Afro-Omani from Zanzibar. He and his followers plundered Central Africa, burning villages, capturing slaves and depopulating whole regions. He was so powerful he controlled much of the territory of the Eastern Congo, where his slaves carried out the back-breaking work of transporting valuable ivory to the coast. When the great British explorer David Livingstone saw the appalling conditions of the trade, he wrote, "To overdraw its evils is a simple impossibility, a sight I strive to drive from memory." The trade in slaves and ivory, though devastating for the Congo, made Tipu Tip rich. By the time of his death, he owned 7 plantations and a staggering 10,000 slaves. His brutality is why many consider him to be one of the inspirations for the villain in the best-selling novel Heart of Darkness. Facts about slavery that you weren't taught in school. Whilst much is known about slavery in the Americas, little is known about the African kingdoms who enslaved other Africans and grew rich in the process. It has been said the Europeans were junior partners to the Africans, as military weakness and disease made them entirely reliant on native kingdoms. Empires such as the Ashanti Empire and the Kingdom of Dahomey became enormously wealthy and powerful from their selling of slaves. Whilst the African role is largely ignored in the West, it has been addressed by modern Africans. In 1999, the president of Benin, when speaking to an all-black church in Baltimore, fell to his knees and begged for forgiveness for his country's role in slavery. Dahomey's major role in slavery was only ended in 1852 when Britain forced an anti-slavery treaty on them. The Ashanti Empire resisted attempts to abolish slavery, and it wasn't until British colonization that the practice stopped completely. What's missing from this picture of Native Americans? The answer? They're black slaves. The Trail of Tears is one of the greatest tragedies of Native American history. The forced relocation of several tribes in the east to allocated lands in the west. But the Indians were not alone in this tragedy. The 5 civilized tribes ventured west with their property, which included the thousands of black slaves they owned. These slaves also endured the terrible hardships of the journey, whilst continuing to serve their native masters. Once in Indian territory, the tribes re-established slavery, expanding it ever westward, and would go on to use this slave labor to rebuild their nations. Writer Paul Chatt Smith describes how the tribes were deeply committed to slavery. They crushed slave revolts, such as the one in the Cherokee Nation in 1842, and when it came to the Civil War, they enthusiastically sided with the Confederacy. Prominent figures such as the Cherokee chief John Ross fought against his people's relocation and was also a slave owner. Many became extremely wealthy from slavery, such as Choctaw chief Greenwood LaFleur. He was a prominent Mississippi planter with 15,000 acres of land and 400 slaves. For some historical context, this is larger than George Washington's plantation, Mount Vernon, and more slaves than Washington owned at the end of his life. Facts about slavery that you weren't taught in school. In 1785, the Barbary pirates attacked American ships and enslaved their crews. This led two future presidents, Thomas Jefferson and John Adams, to go to London to speak to the ambassador of Tripoli, Abdul Rahman Adja. Jefferson asked him, "Why do you make war on nations who have done you no harm? We consider all of mankind our friends who have done us no wrong." The ambassador replied that it was written in the Quran that all nations who did not acknowledge the Prophet Muhammad's authorities were sinners, and that it was the duty of every Muslim to make war upon them and enslave all those they could take as prisoners, and that every Muslim who was slain in battle was sure to go to paradise. Jefferson became determined to use force, and in 1801, when president, he launched the first Barbary War to free American slaves. Facts about slavery that you weren't taught in school. Did you know that Christian slave boys filled the ranks of the Ottoman Empire's elite soldiers, the Janissaries, in a system called devshirme, or blood tax? Christian boys as young as 7 were taken from their parents into slavery. Once captured, the boys were dressed in red to prevent escape. They were forcibly converted to Islam and given an Islamicized name. Christian populations of the Balkans, such as Serbians, Bulgarians and Greeks, were the main source of slaves. Parents went to great lengths to prevent their child's capture, such as marrying them very young or hiding them away from soldiers. The purpose of these slave soldiers was to create a corps of troops firmly loyal to the Sultan. However, not all the slaves became soldiers. Some became bureaucrats or were turned into eunuchs. Occasionally, a slave could achieve a high rank, such as the case of Ibrahim Pasha. However, the practice was largely devastating. A Hungarian adventurer described the pain and sorrow of parents whose children no longer recognized them or their families because they'd become so alienated. And the Bishop of Thessalonica described how Christian boys were forced to fight their own people. Did you know the true story of the Woman King and Africa's female slave raiders? The Woman King movie depicts the Agoge, or the Dahomey Amazons, an all-female group of warriors who fought to protect their kingdom's independence and honor, but the truth is somewhat different. Dahomey was an aggressive African state dedicated to warfare and slave raiding against other Africans, becoming rich and powerful. For centuries, the women of the Agoge took part in this raiding, taking countless numbers of slaves for use at home and abroad. One use was the annual sacrifice of hundreds or thousands of slaves. These women's victims were often part of the millions of slaves shipped to the Americas. One such person was the slave Cudjoe Lewis, who told the harrowing account of how in his youth the Dahomey Amazons attacked his village, committed atrocities, and took many, including him, into slavery. King Gezo, played by John Boyega, was a real figure. He was a staunch supporter of slavery. In response to British pressure to abolish, he claimed, "Slave trade is the ruling principle of my people. It is their source of glory and wealth. A mother lulls their child to sleep with an enemy reduced to slavery." Although the film portrays the women as effective warriors against their African and European enemies, reality was different. The British explorer Richard Burton claimed they maneuver with the precision of a flock of sheep. When Dahomey faced a major clash with the French in the 1890s, both the Amazons and the slave-raiding kingdom itself were totally defeated by the superior French army. In 1999, the president of Benin, when visiting an all-black church in Baltimore, fell to his knees and begged for forgiveness for Dahomey's role in slavery. Like and follow for more.